Today it's our pleasure to be speaking with Father Roger Schroeder. Father Schroeder is a Roman Catholic priest in the Society of the Divine Word and serves as the Louis J. Luzbetak Professor of Mission and Culture at the Catholic Theological Union here in Chicago. He has earned his doctoral degree from the Pontifical Gregorian University at Rome and is the author of today's text, Constance in Context, A Theology of Mission for Today, co-authored by Stephen B. Bevans. Father Schroeder, it's a delight to be speaking with you today.
It's great to be with you today, too. Yeah. Yes. First
of all, Father Schroeder, if you would be willing to share with us a little about your current research, please.
Okay. There's two things. One is I just completed a second edition of a little book called What is the Mission of the Church? A Guide for Catholics. And this is more of a popular book. The initial publication was in 2008. And I was then asked to do an expanded edition on this to bring in what's been happening in the last 10 years, particularly in terms of mission in the United States with the Catholic Church. And so I just completed that it just came out a couple months ago. So that's more on a popular level. This is used what we call in the Catholic world for mission animation, more on the parish, congregational, and diocesan level. And then the current big book I'm working on, I don't know why I do these big books. This is the last big book I'll do. It's called Christian Tradition from a Global Perspective. And I've been working at this for 8 or 9 years. And hopefully in the next 2 weeks, I will finish a good draft of the final chapter 8. And Christian Tradition from a Global Perspective. What I'm doing here is looking at Christianity from its broad strokes across the world over 2,000 years, different Christian churches, denominations, movements in that regards, and looking at the various, what I call threads of Christian tradition, which includes the Bible, how the Bible is used in that in terms of liturgy, ministry, organization, theology. But rather than focusing just on mission, trying to look at Christian tradition in broad strokes. So that's what I'm working on currently. Actually, yesterday I was working on the last chapter. Yeah.
Father Schroeder, in your book, Constance in Context, A Theology of Mission for Today, the text is divided into 3 parts, the first of which presents a biblical theology of mission. In this first part, you show how the work of missions has been driven by different visions of what mission is. And you introduce 3 basic types at this juncture of the book: mission as saving souls and extending the church, mission as discovery of the truth, and mission as commitment to liberation and transformation. Would you be willing briefly to outline each of these 3 models of mission, please?
Okay. So these models are built upon the theology of the Cuban-American Protestant theologian Justo Gonzalez. And the first one, mission as saving souls and extending the church. This is where the starting point is with God's law and maintaining the proper order according to God's plan. So order and law are very important in this regards. So the focus here is on establishing the church, and the church as a place of salvation for people. It focuses more on the spiritual aspects of salvation. And in this case, often there can be a rather negative attitude towards culture. In each of these models, there are both strengths and weaknesses. So each of these have been relevant, and they've been practiced throughout the history of the 2,000 years of Christianity. Examples of this would be people that you're very familiar with, Donald McGavran and Church Growth, and many others, as well as the early Francis Xavier and others. So that would be that particular model. The second type of theology, mission theology, is mission as discovery of the truth. Here the starting point would be human experience and knowledge and reason. So starting more from that perspective. And this looks at, philosophy and culture in a very positive sense, sometimes overly positive, but looks at it in a very positive sense. And revelation in this case is understood in a broader sense. And that God is at work in ways we don't understand, so it takes it in that way. An example of someone like that would be someone called Vincent Lebe. He worked in the early part of the 20th century in China, and he was very much about trying to break the link between colonialism and mission. He wanted the missionaries almost to burn their passports, to be disconnected with that, and really wanted the Chinese to be Chinese and Christians at the same time, for the importance of that cultural link. The third area, mission as commitment to liberation and transformation, Here, the point of departure would be God's presence in history. How is God present in our own history in that regards? So being open to how God is working in the world, again, in ways we have to discern what does that actually mean. And this particular model has both a positive attitude towards culture, but it also is critical because it looks at the things in the world that are also not in line with God's reign, what God's mission is about. This has a more of a holistic understanding of salvation. In other words, looking equally at both the spiritual and the material aspects of how God is working in our lives. There are many examples of all of these cases. Dorothy Day, who some of you may be familiar with, is somebody who brings together both prayer and social action in Catholic worker movement. But this would apply to many others as well.
Father Schroeder, of course, the advantage of using a typology is that you're able to show the various strengths and weaknesses of several positions, but it's probably hard not to have a favorite among these. Is there one of these models or types that you see as particularly true to the historic mission of the Church?
Yeah, well, certainly I would say, and this is, I could speak for a long time on this. I think in terms of the history of the Church, and I study the history of the Church, I'm looking at, what's going on in China in the 7th century with the Syriac Christians. What's happening there? There are 10 million Christians around the year 900 between Antioch and China over Central Asia. So I'm looking at Christianity in a very broad strokes. Now, to answer your question, I think from the perspective of the West, that the first model, that which is of saving souls and establishing the church, that's the one that's been a prominent model in the West. I'm not saying it was the only model, because as we all know, within every tradition, there are different ways, tent making. There's other ways that mission can be done in that way. But certainly that one has been one that's been very prominent. Now that has, again, its strengths and weaknesses. The bad part is when the conquest of the Americas and how people said they were so driven by this that people were forced at the point of a sword to be baptized. So again, but each of these models have both strengths and weaknesses, and we've had both grace and sin for all of them. But I think the first one has been prominent. The second one, Discovery of the Truth. This has been very strong with the Orthodox tradition. So you have the great Orthodox tradition of the early Christian churches, which moved from Constantinople up to Moscow, and now it's more in a diaspora situation. So this has been and they've done some wonderful work in terms of that, what they've done in Alaska and Russia and Greece and other places. The third one is, again, it's been practiced very much more amongst this unknown expanse of Christianity across Asia. And this is by the Syriac Church. And this is, you have the St. Thomas Christians in India that are still very much alive and well. So, in other words, it's hard for me to give an answer of, and in terms of favorites, I would say that it often depends on the context and situations. When Christianity is in a certain place where the government is in favor of it, that's one thing. But when Christians find themselves as being a persecuted minority, well, then their response is going to be different.
We're discussing again Constance in Context, a theology of mission for today with Father Roger Schroeder. Father Schroeder, then what follows in the second part of your book is one of the most useful history of missions available anywhere, in my view. You trace out the works of the evangelists in the early centuries, the ascetics in the 4th and 5th centuries, the monastic orders in the 6th century, and so on until the close of the 20th century. It's truly a marvelous review. While these early figures, if I can make a comparison here, while these early figures certainly achieved a great deal for the church and the cause of Christ, are they missionaries, quote unquote, in the same way that when we reach Francis Xavier or William Carey, we speak of missionaries?
Exactly. Very good question. And many people ask this question. The idea of missionary today is something that comes later, as you said, in the 15th, 16th century. But what I look at in terms of the book is looking at how was God's mission carried out by men and women Christians. So, for example, in the early church, how the reason the gospel spread in an amazing way was that ordinary Christians spread the faith through their daily activities. What Michael Green calls it, gossiping the gospel. In other words, they shared the gospel, even though Christianity was a persecuted religion. They shared the gospel in the marketplace, in their daily lives. And so in other words, they saw baptism as missionary by nature. which I think we've all come back to now in the 20th century. But anyway, so in other words, God's mission is being carried out by these dedicated women and men. But it's not missionary in the sense of what we'd understand it today. Now, again, the way I'd understand the missionary today is someone that is sent out by a church, a community, sent out to proclaim the word of God to another place. So to look at that, I think there are some examples. In the 6th century, we have the Bishop of Rome, and this might be the first time the Bishop of Rome, which we call the Pope today, but in those days, they didn't use the term Pope until the 11th century. So the Bishop of Rome at that time sent 40 Benedictine monks to England to convert the Anglo-Saxons and Jews in England. So they were being sent out as missionaries, but they didn't use the word at that time. But that's what they were doing. Another coming from the Byzantine, the Eastern Church at that time, Theodora, she was the wife of the Empress, and she sent a missionary, Julian, to Nubia, which is a part of present-day Sudan. So we do have those sort of examples. Again, we're using our language today to look back. But it's when we get in, of course, to the 15th, 16th, and then, of course, in the 19th century and on, that the idea of missionary, the way we understand it today, becomes more prominent.
That's an extremely helpful distinction that you've just helped us make, and that is that baptism is conceived as a missionary activity. And so when we trace how baptism was operating, we can see that the early monks in the 6th century and the ascetics truly were engaging in missionary activity. That's an extremely helpful distinction for me. Still, if I can press further into that just briefly, so there is something new that's taking place with the type of missionary activity that we see modeled by the Jesuits, for example, or Francis Xavier. How is it that this type of modern missionary activity is a post-Reformation phenomenon? What's the connection between the Reformation and missionary activity as we understand it?
I think that what we do in mission is we sort of respond to the signs of the time, to what's available to us at the time. So in the early church, they dealt with what was available at that time. Then a monastic movement came up. That's what was, you had people drawn to that lifestyle. And it worked in those days. You know, it's not the same thing today. There are some today, but it's not the majority. And what happens then in terms of the Catholic world, with the Jesuits, this is after the Reformation, this is during the Catholic Reformation, as I call it, not the Counter-Reformation, but a Reformation in the Catholic Church itself. So what happens there is they see the need for specifically missionaries going out. You had Franciscans, Dominicans before this, but again, their main life was a bit different. They were what we called mendicants. So that was the time. Now, if you jump forward to William Carey, the very significance there, you have the society model coming out of the Protestant tradition. And again, what William Carey said is, how do we, our obligation to bring the gospel, conversion of the heathens, they use the language of that time, the Catholics use the same language, with the means that we have today. So what they did is they followed sort of what was the patterns of how it was done in those days. And that was the society model. It was built upon some of the business models of the time that were being used, international. How do you connect with India? You have a South Indian trading company. How do you do this? In other words, they used the means of their time to press the gospel. So I think as the Catholics were evolving on their side with what I still call society model, I think the Protestants were developing also their society model based on their own context. And they had a different situation. So I think we're always adjusting, we're using the means of our times. So for example, today, the means of our times are social media, which we're using now. And in that way, so in other words, how do we use the means of our times to spread the gospel and the good news?
Father Schroeder, thank you for that reflection. I'm really delighted to hear that you're working on a new text that carries the working title now, Christian Tradition from a Global Perspective. Could you talk to me a little bit about the question of sources? You're tracing back the history of missions through some very obscure times and places where sources are very difficult to find. How do you manage the question of sources?
I mean, that's obviously a big challenge. First of all, as you know from your own work as well, when we're working in such a broad area and we're breaking new ground, So this understanding of what I call the new history of Christianity, which, focusing more on a polycentric understanding of Christian history, not just looking at the mountaintops, at the councils, but how is Christianity actually being lived by people around the world. I mean, that's a big challenge. So I've been very dependent, if I'm allowed to make this reference, to the Urban and Sundquist work that they're doing in the history of the world Christian movement. They were able to get the finances to bring together 120 consultants from different Christian traditions in different parts of the world. I was a part of that. I was one of those consultants. I hardly contributed anything, but I learned a lot in those conversations. We'd get together for 3 days, look at 200 pages of text, and look at different perspectives. I still remember when we looked at volume 2, and we said, how are we going to handle the question of slavery and Christianity in volume 2? And we had people sitting around the table who could speak about those different perspectives. What was going on in the Afro-Brazilian communities? What was going on in Africa at that time? What was happening in what was called the slave religion? So in other words, you try to bring together the sources. Now, I had the advantage there, and I'm very, they have done some great work. Now, the current work that I'm working on in terms of the global perspective, it's even more difficult because I don't have all those resources. So for example, I asked my biblical scholars, who can tell me about who has written a history of a biblical interpretation and use of the scripture from a global perspective? No one has done it yet. Now there are bits and pieces here and there, and that's where I look, the bits and pieces. How do you talk about spiritual movements? And when you talk about spiritual movements today, I talk about what I call the spiritual churches. That would be the Pentecostals, all the independent churches, and all of that. And, Pentecostalism, there's a lot written on that, of course. But in terms of the independent churches, how do you talk about, how do they understand, ministry and things like that? So I have to sort of pick and hunt. And what I find, the current work I'm on is really just getting things started. I'm hoping that there are people in scripture, in liturgy, in spirituality that will pick it up and say, oh, we need to look now at how do we look at this from a global perspective. I don't know if that helps you or not, but I mean, it's really sort of there. And there are other works. The Cambridge have a very good series has come out. I'm working through their 20th century. It includes many different authors, and they've got some excellent articles. Some of the chapters are not as helpful as others, as you know, that's the way it is, and you have different authors working together. But some of the authors are excellent.
Father Schroeder, in the final part of your text, Constance in Context, A Theology for Mission, today you bring out 4 additional models of mission, and they are these: mission as participation in the mission of the triune God, mission as liberating service of the triune God, mission as proclamation of Jesus Christ as universal Savior, and mission as prophetic dialogue. If I may ask, in your view, which of these models has the greatest potential to serve and reach our world today?
And again, I'm going to sort of dodge the question a little bit and just say that I think it really depends on the context in which we're working. So if I can just use India as an example, where I've been a few times, not for an extended time, but I've been there a number of times. So for example, in India, you can see all 3 of these models at work, depending on which part of India you're in. Now, of course, India is a very complex country, and different languages spoken in different states. So it's almost more than one country in some ways. So for example, in terms of the first one, mission as participation, the mission of the triune God, there are certain parts of India or peoples that can really be involved in interreligious dialogue. And that's what they can do. And I don't know how familiar the audience is in terms of what's going on in India. There's a real push in India. It's very dangerous for Christians now, because they're saying to be a Christian is not to be Indian. And so there's a very strong reaction against anything to do with Christianity. So in parts of India where particularly Hinduism is very strong, there are people who are doing interreligious dialogue, which is what they're able to do. And so, example, that would be looking at mission, that first one, participation in the mission of God. The second, delivering service of the triune God. This would be where people are in situations, and there's a lot of places in India working with the poor. And so what does that mean? This is the Mother Teresa sort of work, working in Calcutta and other places. And the situation of India, the great amount of poverty there. And so what do they do there? And they're not trying to baptize people immediately or something like that. But I've been to Calcutta. I mean, there are people who are dying in the gutters. So, I mean, mission there, you're looking at what is the reign of God? What would Jesus do to see someone in that situation? Then as you move to Assam area, this is the far northeast area of India. This is north of Bangladesh. And up there, you have people who are clamoring for the gospel. They are coming. They want to be baptized. They want the word of God preached. And so that's where you have missionaries of different denominations. And so that's the model of mission, or the understanding of mission that needs to be done there. So I think, different contexts. This is in the same country, a very diverse country. I mean, every country is diverse, but India is one of the most diverse, I think. So I think, it depends on different places. And again, I think each can have their strengths and weaknesses. Now, the idea of prophetic dialogue, this is something that Steve Bevins and I, when we finished, we were going to stop writing the book at chapter 11. But then we said, wait a minute, should we just stop with those descriptions? Or can we somehow bring a synthesis together of all these three different models of theology, or theologies of mission? And that's where we came up, and I think there's a longer story to this about the prophetic dialogue. And so what we wanted to do was draw upon the strengths and weaknesses or potential dangers of every theology, and to bring them together. So we developed, and this was not just us thinking. This came out of a major missionary process working with my own missionary order. We're now the 6th largest Catholic missionary order in the church. We're 6,000 missionaries working around the world. Most of our missionaries today are from Asia, a growing number from Africa. And they came together every 6 years to talk about what does mission mean today. And they're the ones coming out of their own practice of mission. So it's not just theologians sitting in their ivory towers. But how do we? So the Asians were saying mission is about dialogue. The ones in Latin America were saying mission is about prophecy. And they were focusing. So we said, how can we understand this together? So then we have this idea, again, drawing upon that. And that was a chapter in 2000. And we were finishing a book around 2002, 2003. How can we use that as a synthesis? So the idea of prophetic dialogue is an attempt to try to draw something together. So for example, the dialogical part is, how do we recognize how God is already present? And this could be among people who they say they don't even believe in God, the searchers, or the God-fearers, as they call them in the past. So how do you dialogue with how God is already present? At the same time, the prophecy is where God is not present or not recognized. So for every model of mission, I think that there is this dynamic that is going on. And I think it's a challenge for us. So we're trying to put this together. And this idea of prophetic dialogue, we later developed into another book called Prophetic Dialogue. And this is a book we published in 2011. And this then takes that idea and stretches it out. It makes it, when we said it in 2004, we were just getting started with it. Later, we realized we need to do more. So for example, when I was in South Africa, and I was at a conference, I was the only Catholic in the room. And on one side of the room were Pentecostals, and the other side of the room were Conciliar, were the Dutch Reformed folks. And the same sort of total of 50 people divided in the middle. So when I was talking about prophetic dialogue, which I was asked to talk about there, this is in UNISA, this is where David Bosch taught, and where of course the tradition of missiology continues there. And on the one side of the room, the Pentecostals were saying, yes, prophecy. And I said, yeah, but what about the dialogue? How do you listen to how God is already working? What are the questions that are searching in people's hearts already? And then on the other side of the room, and again, this is one day, one dynamic, those who are of the conciliar Protestants, they were talking, oh yes, dialogue. And I said, yeah, but where do you bring the word of God in to confront, the evil? So the words that you need also the prophetic element. So I think it presses a point for us about this. And it's not, when I say mission, and again, this is where I think of it in a broader sense. I think of a couple years ago, I was talking to a young woman. She's an evangelical. She does campus ministry here in the United States. And she said, I have this name, Prophetic Dialogue, next to my mirror in the morning. And she's like, what do I need to do today that's both dialogical and prophetic with the students that I'll be working with today? So in other words, and again, I'm not saying this is going to last for 1,000 years, but I think at the point we're at, we're trying to find a way of recognizing differences in mission, different theologies and everything like that. But what can bring us together? You know, and again, like I said, that day that I was the only Catholic in the room in South Africa at UNISA with Pentecostals and Conciliar Protestants, but yet we could talk together about it. It doesn't mean we walked out the room being the same, no. But again, I think that I have found this idea to be very, I think it's helpful, and it makes us think and reflect on our own faith.
Father Schroeder, I'm very grateful for your reflection there. If I may close with a question that we've been asking all of the participants on this program, and that is this: what would it mean for the church to be united today? How would we recognize the unity of the church, and what is it that we can do as Christians to pursue the unity for which Jesus prayed?
And I thank you very much for this question, because this is something very much in my own heart. Again, this comes from my perspective, from my own studies, and my own experience as well. So I think that within Protestantism, in the 19th and early part of the 20th century, there were theological differences, but they were able to come together for the sake of mission. They came together in Edinburgh in 1910. But even though there were differences, in terms of social gospel and different ways, they were able to come together around the point of mission in 1910. Now, as the 20th century went on, those differences started to be lifted up higher. Now, for me, I think what I would try to learn from that is, if we can focus more on mission rather than doctrine, I think we can get further in terms of understanding and appreciating one another. I'm not saying we become the same. We need the diversity. With God's grace needs to be expressed in multiple ways. Not one expression is enough. So I agree in that. But I think that, and I learned this, well, I don't know, I've been learning this for a long time, and I continue to learn. But I worked as a missionary in Papua New Guinea for 6 years. And I'll never forget, one night I was in the village of Pangarat, and I was with a man who was very active in the Catholic Church, but he never was baptized. And at one point, after a year, after I got to know him well enough, and he was hosting me in the village that night, and I asked him, "Why have you never been baptized?" And he said, "Look at my village." He said, a third of my village is Roman Catholic, a third is South Seas Evangelical Mission, and a third is Assembly of God. And he said, before the missionaries came, we were one. Now we are divided in three. So the Western missionaries have brought division to us. Now, the story is not quite that simple, of course. But again, it just struck me so much to say, what is happening here? Again, I'm not speaking against diversity in churches, denominations. But I'll never forget what Simon told me that day. He said, look at our village. This is a village of 300 people. It's a small village. But yet they were divided, in Papua New Guinea, normally they are united in terms of their beliefs. And I guess for me, I have been blessed to see many good opportunities where this can happen. I'm a member of the American Society of Missiology. I've been a part of that for 27 years. And we bring together Roman Catholics, Conciliar Protestants, what we call independents. And we probably have to change that word because it's starting to be so broad now. It includes evangelicals of many different stripes, of course, many different denominations, includes Pentecostals, it includes Seventh-day Adventists, it's very broad at the moment. But yet we come together, and for me, this is a wonderful way. We can come together. Now, we don't think the same. We have different theologies, but yet we can talk about issues of mission. So this last conference we had a couple of weeks ago, we were on Interfaith Friendship. How can you talk about interfaith friendship? By talking about it in that way, we don't get into all the different theologies, which, again, there's time where we have to talk about the theology. But yet, how do we talk about interfaith friendships? And I noticed that this year there were 2 people from Moody who were at the conference. And I think last year was the first that anyone from Moody was at the conference that I know of. Again, there's 300 people there, so I don't know everybody. But I know this year because one of the people from Moody led us in worship one of the mornings. So in other words, we have the folks coming together from different places. I was the first Catholic to lecture at the Seventh-day Adventist University in Michigan. And again, it's through these relationships between people from different churches, denominations. And they said, would you as a Catholic be willing to lecture at our university? And I said, sure, you invite me, I will come. So, I think, and again, I don't want to be idealistic. I know On the ground, there are many challenges. Also amongst academics, there are challenges. But to me, I think if there's a way that we can focus more on, being a part of God's mission in a variety of ways, recognizing there are a variety of ways, it's challenging, because how do we do this? Find common ground while at the same time maintaining who we are in our own Christian beliefs, in our own theology, in our own traditions, which, we need to maintain that. But I think what it requires of me, for example, it requires me to learn, to be more open, to realize that God is bigger than I believe. Way back in the 70s, I studied 2 summers with the Wycliffe Bible translators, with the Summer Institute of Linguistics. And I was one of a handful of Catholics. And I remember that one of the first meals, somebody said, "Are any Catholics Christians?" And I had to sort of think, now what is being said here? So I had to begin to understand, what did that mean? And then once I understood it, I said, okay, let's just go with it. Let's just keep the conversation going. So in other words, to realize that God is bigger than we know. And so, but at the same time, and this is, my students ask me this all the time. They say, how can we enter into the dialogue without watering down our own principles, without losing our faith, things like that. And anyways, I want to understand and I teach students who are preparing to do ministry in the church, but trying to also help them to understand that you can do both. This is the prophetic dialogue. It's a bit of some would call it synthesis, some call it a creative tension.
It's been our privilege today to be speaking with Father Roger Schroeder, co-author of Constance in Context, A Theology of Mission for Today. Father Schroeder, thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Anderson. Very good. Appreciate the conversation.